say a bit about myself, do you, Adam?
Yes.
Which is going to take a while.
Yeah,
Because I'm getting old and I've done lots of things by now. So I guess these days I hold myself out as being a philosopher, as a literary critic, as someone who's done some creative writing, with some success at a professional level. I'm the author most recently of a book called Freedom of Religion and the Secular State, which is just published from Wiley Blackwell this year. I'm working on another book for Wiley Blackwell called 50 Great Myths About Atheism, which I'm co-authoring with Udo Schuklenk. The other book I'm working on, which is to be published by MIT Press, is called Humanity Enhanced. Now that will be a version of my PhD thesis on human enhancement technologies and how that intersects with the law and public policy and so on. So that's a very general view of my background. I guess the most relevant thing to talk about today is the issues to do with enhancement technologies and the future. The book it's got the title Humanity Enhanced, and it's about the intersection between the law and politics and human enhancement technology. Now, it's a fairly narrow focus when I say human enhancement technology. I'm really talking about pretty near future or present day stuff. I'm talking about things like preimplantation, genetic diagnosis, which we can do now in many ways. I'm talking about the prospects of human reproductive cloning. I'm talking about possibly more radical steps such as genetic manipulation of human embryos for the purpose of enhancement of our capacities. Right? So I'm talking about genetic engineering, preimplantation genetic diagnosis, which doesn't involve any actual engineering of embryos, and related to that, cloning technologies as applied to human beings. What we do with those technologies is a matter of fraught political debate. There have been many laws enacted. We have to think about what kind of principles should apply when we enact those sorts of laws. What sort of regulations should cover this into the future? Those are the kinds of issues that have concerned me.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on unequal access to genetic or augmentation technologies in general? If it can't be distributed equally, should it be allowed?
I don't think you can say broadly yes or no on that. Lots of things are not distributed equally, but we allow them. Access to private schools is not distributed equally, but we allow it. Access to computer technology is not distributed equally, but we allow it. So we don't seem to have, as a society, a legal principle that we ban things because they're not distributed equally, because the rich will have differentially high access to them. Generally speaking, we allow that. What we worry about is whether some kind of social safety net should be put under things. So take private schools. It's one thing that we allow the rich to go to private schools, some which are very expensive, but while that may be a social concern in that it can exacerbate inequalities, at least we can take steps like having good we have good public schooling for those who can't afford the high quality private schooling. That doesn't always work, of course. I mean, a lot of jurisdictions have school systems that are failing. But what we usually do, the general public policy, is not to ban things, but to try to ensure that those who don't have vast economic resources are not going to be too badly disadvantaged, at least, and social competition will be able to continue. Perhaps not an entirely level playing field, but at least on a playing field that's not so steep as to cause just horrendous social consequences. So look, there's no simple answer to the question you ask. Some people seem to think that because a resource can't be distributed equally, the rich will have differential access to it. That's a reason to ban it. That is not applied in any other field. On the other hand, you can't say there'll be no problems. There quite conceivably could be problems.
So why are people suggesting that they should be applied to the areas of human enhancement and disregard other areas?
One, I think, is people in one group just plain do not like these technologies. They find them scary, they find them unnatural, they find them, violating their view of the world, which might be a religious view of the world. A whole range of reasons why they just might feel fear and repugnance when they're confronted with these technologies. And so they'll grab onto any reason they can find as a rationalisation to oppose them or to hinder them. Yeah, that could be one reason. Another reason might be, and this might be something we could be more sympathetic to, they might say, well, we don't really like the unequal access to, say, private schooling either. And ideally, we would like maybe not even to have private schools, but it's not realistic to not have private schools, right? They might think this is an area where it's realistic to be able to, block a move that would produce greater social inequalities. So it might be a pragmatic reason like that. And that might be at a quite conscious level, or it might be at a more unconscious level. And there may be at other reasons. So I don't think these people necessarily fall into one category. There may be a number of reasons why they take a different view with innovations like this from what they take with, say, private schooling. And they may not be entirely aware of their motives themselves. They may have a mixture of the motives that I just spoke of, or even other things.
Yeah, I can imagine like a raging debate. People would say, yes, another thing that rich will have access to and the rest of us won't have.
Sure. But the trouble is you're just never going to be able to implement that as a general policy, that every time something comes along that the rich are going to have greater access to, because that's what money gives you, you therefore ban that thing. I mean, that could just never work unless we had a fundamental policy of total economic equality. We'd have to have some kind of very harshly imposed socialist system to do that. Now, maybe you could argue for that, right? I'm not even arguing for or against any particular economic policy, but what I am saying is as long as we have the kind of economy we do, we cannot apply a principle like that. It just won't work. And you can't really make an exception here. You need principles that apply generally. So what is distinguishable about this then becomes the question. If it's not just one more thing that the rich have unequal access to, if it's something more than that distinguishes it from those other things, well, what is the something more? What is the distinguishing feature?
So what policy or mix of policies do you see as being reasonable controls over enhancement, and especially enhancement with biotechnologies, which you focus on?
Look, that's a huge question. And I don't have a simple answer to that question. Look, I'm not going to pretend I know the answer to it because I don't. I think that you need to have policies that allow some flexibility for people to do the kinds of things that they want to do with the technology. You can't have draconian authoritarian policies that give people no room to manoeuvre. If you're going to regulate these technologies in some way, you're going to have to look at the quite specific problems that you're trying to solve. So let me give you one example. I do think it's a problem if we start using technologies like this to give parents total control over the formation of the personalities of their children. I actually do worry when I see proposals to use the technology to modify personality. As it is now, we are a mix of genes and environment, basically. That's the uterine environment, and it's the environment as we're growing up. Our parents use all kinds of techniques to mould our personalities. And we kind of accept that. But even now, we can feel a little bit like we're the puppets of our parents. If our parents start not just giving us good nutrition and not just giving us a genetic potential to take advantage of things like good nutrition, but actually start trying to mould our personalities across both genetics and environment, I think we do run the risk that we're going to start feeling even more like the puppets of our parents than we did. And so there does seem to me to be a rational problem there as to how people are going to feel if not just your cognitive potential, your physical potential is being manipulated, but the actual way your personality will work out is manipulated. I mean, think now, if our parents had the ability to brainwash us totally into a view of the world or values and so on. And a point would come even with any genetic technologies where we would start to worry about that. So the area of personality control is one that actually makes me uncomfortable. Not because of any religious view I have or any view about violating nature, but just a view to do with parent-children relationships. And to go further, even if you'd accept some kind of personality control, what if a parent tried to genetically modify a child to be more amenable to going along with the parent's wishes, or to be more gullible in believing the sorts of things the parent tells the child, right? Well, I think we would worry. If you could use genetics as well as environmental factors to control those sorts of things, I think that would actually be quite worrying. That's got even nothing to do with differential wealth. It's just to do with the kinds of things that worry me about relationships within families. So that's an example. It's not answering your question because you asked me quite a broad question, and I then gave you a very broad, abstract answer. But I wanted to say something concrete.
Well, I mean, it seems as though there is a debate at the moment about augmentation technologies. But what kinds of pedigrees or types of arguments are currently dominating the debates around enhancement technologies today and in the past, or in the recent past?
Look, a range of them. They range from the rational at one end to do with things like social inequalities, like we were talking about, differential access from the wealthy and what social impacts that may have. I mean, I think that's at one end of the spectrum of rationality. I think that is quite a rational argument, even though you have to tease it out. At the other end of the spectrum, there are arguments about, we are violating nature, we are playing God, we're in some way undermining human dignity, whatever that means. I think some of those arguments get into the realm of the semi-religious, and it's a kind of vague religion that's never even established its doctrines in any clear-cut way. But it's a kind of religious or mystical view of the world that's being put forward here. So there's a vast range. In between, there are arguments that could, in some circumstances, have some merit. And again, they are arguments about relationships within families. So I think some of these are taken too far. I mean, one argument is just that parents in genetically modifying their children are somehow taking away the autonomy of their children. That's simple. Now, I don't think that will stand up to analysis. If I had been genetically modified to have, say, a greater potential for, to develop physical strength, I don't think that would be taking away my autonomy in any way, any more than if my genetic potential naturally had been such that I had a greater potential for physical strength. So I think the argument, when it's run that simply, is not particularly rational, but it is a common argument. So that's at least three areas in which the argument falls, but I'm sure we could think of others.
Well, what is missing from public debate at the moment? What do you think then they should be focusing on, which the debates are not focusing on?
Look, I think the debate really has to be focused on things like the harms and the benefits. Now, when you're talking about genetic modification for the purpose, say, of resistance to disease, you really should be focusing on the benefit, unless some downside can be identified. But on the face of it, that's a benefit. I think we really should always be focusing on those ordinary secular benefits, not benefits to do with some religious view of the world or some sacramental concept of nature or anything like that. I think it's the role of the state to even think about those things. It's the secular benefits and harms that we should be focused on. And although people do talk about those, it's not so much that those are not talked about, it's that a whole lot of other things get brought in as well, and we lose focus on what we really should be focusing on.
Often people bring up the argument that this random element that we're born with, our genetic potential seems to be somewhat random, and some people end up with configurations or mind states that are not particularly conducive to flourishing or happiness.
Right.
But doesn't that give meaning to life? Doesn't suffering in some form give some sort of abstract meaning to life? And don't we need people to suffer to create great art and music?
It sounds like you're playing devil's advocate here. But look, realistically, no one is arguing about how we're going to get rid of all human suffering. Look, if we could get rid of all human suffering, from my point of view, that would be a good thing. But I don't think it's a realistic thing to talk about anyway. As for whether we're going to stifle great music and great art by genetically modifying embryos, I mean, again, that's not realistic. That's not something that really should be part of this debate at all. However, let's imagine for the sake of argument that we had great power and flexibility in the way we could modify the genetic potential of embryos. Why would we not use that to give people greater potential to develop creative powers and problem-solving intelligence and all the rest of it? That seems like the obvious thing to do. If you had more people having those capacities, and those capacities are actually realised in the environment, you would end up with a more diverse society, not a less diverse society. Having people with low problem-solving intelligence or low creativity, that doesn't create greater diversity in the actual society. If we had a society composed only of people with the high potential, we'd achieve all sorts of synergies, network effects, whatever, and I'm sure we'd get greater diversity.
What are people generally afraid of when it comes to enhancement technology, augmentation technology?
Well, they're afraid of a whole range of things. I mean, they are afraid in some cases that the rich will get hold of the technologies and the poor won't, and social divisions will be exacerbated, possibly in ways that will end up, some people say will destroy democracy, because you'll end up with this underclass that will be so distrusted because it will be so inferior in intelligence or whatever. Democracy will be destroyed, and that will in turn have further flow-on effects. In any event, you'll end up with at least two tiers of a society, with an overclass oppressing an underclass. So there'll be utilitarian bad consequences. All those kinds of things are things that people fear, perhaps to some extent rationally. At the other end of the scale, people feel all sorts of other things, like God will be upset, or some sacramental order of nature will be violated, all kinds of things. People also fear that social institutions that we have at the moment that give life meaning, to use that word that I don't really like, but give life a certain contour, and some of those social institutions will pass away if we make large-scale changes to ourselves. Various social institutions have passed away in the past, of course, but sometimes that's got an upside, sometimes that's got a downside. But it's easy to be fearful about institutions that you find meaningful and empowering passing away. So again, you get a whole spectrum of things that people fear, from, in some cases, quite gut-level fears that they can't even define, in some cases sort of quasi-religious fears about violation of a natural order or playing God or whatever. In some cases, effects on particular social institutions. In some cases, fears about the general direction that society will take if the enhancements are available to some, not others. So there's never going to be a simple answer to those sorts of questions. What do people fear? They fear a whole lot of things. And once again, I'm not sure that people, any individual, is necessarily going to know exactly what combination of things that individual fears. You're not always in a position where your own motivations are transparent to you.
On the other side of the coin, what are people hopeful about these technologies?
Oh, I guess obvious things that will cure diseases, for a start. We may be able to eliminate some diseases. Beyond therapy, as we say, beyond addressing diseases, we may be able to enhance capacities, to levels that go above merely being not sick or not injured. So we may be able to enhance intelligence, however we define intelligence. We may be able to enhance creativity. If you live in a society where the average intelligence level has been raised, or the average creativity level has been raised, not only will individuals benefit, but there'll presumably be network effects and broader social developments. People with these different capacities who've developed them in different ways environmentally as they've grown up, will synergise, and works of art will be created, new ideas will be, all kinds of things, presumably, all kinds of innovations could come from what you do when you change people for the better in the sense that capacities are altered in ways that we would think of as improvements. So individual improvements that we would want, everyone wants to be smarter, longer lived, etc., and social improvements.
Social improvements.
Sure. I mean, if you've got lots of very smart people around, lots of very creative people around, that has an effect on the wider society. It's a good thing not just for those people, but for the wider society, for the products and innovations that those people will create as individuals, and as not just as individuals, but when smart person one comes into contact with smart person two, or creative person one comes to creative person two, that creates an effect. The same as access to the internet creates an effect. We've all got all these extra powers and bits of information at our fingertips now, and when one person with all that, his or her fingertips, comes into connection with someone else who has it, that creates synergies. So, social effects as well.
Okay. It's interesting to think that we've evolved, and our intelligence has evolved. Do you, over time, and we've reached a certain point where societies have become possible. The type of societies have become possible. Probably wouldn't have been if we were still at the level of a chimpanzee or our ancestor, the Homo habilis, or whatever it is.
Right.
Do you think with enhancements in intelligence, that is the front-brained part of our thinking,
Right.
Do you think that would allow for greater forms of social cohesion?
Yeah, there's a hard one. Look, I don't know. I don't want to pretend to know things I don't. What I do know is if you have people who are good at solving problems or good at creating things, it's not just good for them as individuals. Those people get together and they form networks and they brainstorm together. And innovation and products and art and all the rest of it doesn't just come out of individuals. It comes out of the network effects of those individuals getting together. So I expect positive things will come out of it. Now, whether what comes out of it might be larger or more integrated societies, sort of, I mean, I don't know. I can't make those sorts of predictions. Often we achieve those sorts of things by new kinds of institutions, new kinds of organisation and so on. So it's hard to know what the direct effect is just by making people say smarter and more creative. Arguably, smarter and more creative people are going to be better at coming up with innovations about how society gets organised. But since I'm not one of those smarter and more creative people myself, I can't predict what innovations they will come up with, right? But I do think we have every reason to be positive about it rather than to be kind of negative about it, thinking it's just a kind of competitive game in which all that happens is that a different group of people end up at the top of some kind of ladder of competition. I think that's a very negative way of looking at it.
And that's something I'd like to explore more. Why do you think access to enhancement technologies will be more focused on how intelligent people network with each other rather than there be just some sort of ladder of competition?
Well, I think it's just natural. When you give people greater capacity to do stuff, which isn't necessarily by changing them technologically, but by giving them tools, by giving them technology that they can use, or by educating them, it's just natural that people do network. They do use it. If you get a bunch of people who've been highly educated at university, which is a kind of technology, you might say, you take people through certain processes that change the way their brains are wired up. They don't, generally speaking, just go off in a corner and think, I'm really smart, I'll go play. They do get together, and innovations, results come out of that. We have not had the experience of people with better levels of education just using them for competitive advantage. That happens, of course, but we also have the experience of people with better levels of education using it to synergise, to network, and to create through all that. And the same applies to giving people technologies like access to the internet or personal computers or whatever further IT sort of applications we've seen in the last couple of decades. They don't just use it for selfish competitive reasons. They do that, of course, but there's also this other element which is so important, it should not be overlooked, that I can be collaborating with someone in Canada writing a book because the technology enables me to do that in a way that was not possible 20 years ago.
Do you think it's a positive thing to have skeptics in the area of human enhancement, perhaps promoting debates to raise precautionary awareness to problems we might have to face to better prepare ourselves?
Oh yeah, look, up to a point, yes. It worries me when I see sort of sceptical arguments that really are not very rational arguments. And it worries me when I see the population frightened by arguments that are not very rational. So if I went back 10 years ago, say, to when there's a lot of public debate going on in Australia and elsewhere about the prospects of human cloning, of stem cell research generally on human embryos, there were a lot of irrational fears around. And a lot of the public policy at the time was addressing those irrational fears, and not necessarily addressing them by saying, no, you shouldn't worry for these reasons, but addressing them by saying we'll have draconian prison sentences in case people do things that the public doesn't like, right? So I think that the opposition to it can sometimes be irrational and destructive and a waste of social resources. That said, yes, of course we should have rational critique. I don't think we should ever be in a situation with any innovation that's been contemplated where everyone's just absolutely positive, Pollyanna-ish, gung-ho, and no one's saying, oh, hang on, let's stop, let's think about what the possible social downside should be. It's important to have that kind of debate.
Has there been any particular writers or writings in general that have made you stop and think, well, that's something I never considered?
Oh, that's a hard one, because I've read so much of this stuff by now. No, there are things that give me pause in the sense, not in the sense I haven't considered them, but just in the sense I think, there really is a problem here. But as for thinking of someone who came up with an argument, I think, oh my God, that would never even occur to me as a problem. Not particularly. I think the kinds of problems, at least in a general sense, are fairly obvious. And they are problems about things like differential access or what's going to happen within families. Those kinds of things are fairly obvious areas where there could be problems, and it's then a matter of teasing out the detail and what's really realistic as a downside, what you might really do to avoid it. Of the good life, well, I mean, you know the answer I'm going to give to that. I don't think it's the role of the state, which is what's going to enforce things, to decide what the good life is. We live in pluralistic society. I mean, it's not realistic for one thing. We live these days in very large societies, millions of people who've come from all kinds of different cultural backgrounds, all kinds of religious and moral and whatever backgrounds, people with many different sorts of values, many ways of wanting to present themselves. And the state really has to run the show with regulation that enables all of those different kinds of people to get along. The way to do that is not to impose some particular view of what the good life is. The way to do that is to have a framework in which people with many different views of the good life are actually able, nonetheless, to live in the same society. Now, that means some regulation. We want to have some sort of scheme of property, and we want to enforce it, so we don't want people stealing from each other. There can be a debate about what form that should take, but we will need some sort of property scheme, and that will need to be enforced. We'll need some sort of basic economic schemes with contract law and corporations law and so on, and we need the core criminal law, certainly. We need some sort of regulation that deters people from killing and raping and assaulting each other. But what you really need, and this is the great lesson of the wars of the 17th century and so on, is a framework in which different kinds of people with different understandings of the larger universe and different values, different views of the good, can all somehow get along with each other, at some basic level. That's been the huge lesson for, when we stopped imposing religions on each other.
A liberal society makes a sharp distinction between a sphere of personal moral views and that of the law. No one can use the law to impose his or her beliefs on others, so whose decision is it to make the law? Is it just based on the majority? In such case, wouldn't that mean the majority is imposing their view on the minority group?
Well, the law does impose you'd say it's a view, it imposes restrictions on people. The law is made by courts and by parliaments. Historically, it's been made largely by courts, developing customary ideas of how people should relate to each other. But in more recent centuries, it's been made more by parliaments. So, they're quite definable institutions within society that make the law. In order to get laws enacted, you have to have at least enough electoral support for your overall program to have some kind of control on the day within Parliament, and so ultimately, yes, the majority has a big say in what laws get enacted. So laws are enacted partly by the will of the majority, but rather indirectly through social institutions such as the court system and the parliamentary system. And yes, laws do impose restrictions and requirements upon the general population, including minorities who may not disagree with the law. All of that is true. That's how democracy operates. However, it doesn't follow that the tyranny of the majority should operate. You can still ask, well, what principles should the majority, the electorate, the parliament, the courts be applying? That's a separate question that you can ask. And you can say, well, one principle that they should be applying is that they should not be too draconian about making sure everyone has to live the same kind of life or have the same kind of values or believe in the same gods. One principle you might adopt is that people should have a great deal of freedom to believe what strikes them as true, to express themselves, express what strikes them as true, and express their personalities. So we have a freedom of speech principle operating here. These are perfectly good principles for the majority and for the electorate and for the parliament and the courts to apply, without any taking away of the fact that those will be the sorts of institutions in society that will make the decisions. So on the one hand, the decisions will be made by certain institutions, but on the other hand, you can ask what principles they should use when they make those decisions. And those principles that they should be using may be highly liberal principles that enable a great deal of freedom.
Well, if we are to tolerate enhancement technologies in general, is there any reason to interfere with citizens' freedoms to use enhancement technologies?
Oh, well, there could be. It depends on what harm is going to be done by the use of those technologies. Look, we talk about enhancement technologies as if we know what enhancement means, as if we know what it is to make someone better in some sense, but that becomes very arguable. You could easily imagine that there are individuals who think that, say, a girl, they have a female child, they might think that she is better in some sense if she's more docile and gullible or something, right? That within their culture and value set, which prima facie you might want to tolerate. But if they employ that value set in a way that we might think is actually harmful to their child, that would be a reason to interfere. We might think that for all sorts of reasons affecting both the child and larger society, that use of genetic technology would be a harmful use. And we could probably think of other uses that would be harmful uses. So sure, there certainly could be reasons to intervene. I have to struggle to identify what the reasons are, though, because I don't think our starting point should be, we just intervene across the board because, we have some kind of repugnance towards the technology or some view that, our understanding of nature or of, the relationship between the empirical world and the transcendent world is being violated or something. That would be a wrong way of going about it. That would be the state taking on a role that I think we should have learnt by now the state should not be taking on.
What are realistic examples of enhancement technologies that an individual citizen may choose that would result in negative effects for others or even society?
Look, it's not obvious to me what they would be, because think of the enhancement technologies that an individual would choose for himself or herself. They would presumably be things like drugs that might make them smarter. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment, or substances that might contribute to their length of life. I don't think that those have a serious downside for society as a whole. I think, if anything, they might have an upside for society as a whole. I don't think it's harmful if people are living longer. I don't think it's harmful if people are taking drugs that boost their intelligence. I mean, there's a very popular drug that does that to some extent. It's called coffee or caffeine. I don't think that's harmful. So I don't think that there are obvious things that people will be using, at least in the short term, that are going to have some larger social impact. But that's talking about things that people are doing to modify themselves, right? The interesting thing, though, to take that extra step is, what if they're doing stuff to modify their children? And there you get into some interesting questions. Again, I don't think it's a great problem if children could somehow be genetically enhanced to have a greater potential to develop problem-solving intelligence. I mean, it's a very interesting question whether that could ever be done. But say it could be, I don't think that would be so terrible. It might be good. It might be good for society as well as the individual child. But you could imagine some things where the parent, because of the parent's set of values, thinks that it would be a good thing to modify the child's potentials in ways that would actually reduce the child's prospects in life. You come up with examples like that.
People would often say that taking certain forms of hallucinogens opens the mind.
Right.
However, that hasn't been really, I don't know if that's been proven objectively, but it certainly gives people a different experience of the world. Some people have negative reactions or react negatively to hallucinogens and end up being a little bit psychopathic as a result. Do you think some enhancement technologies have this potential?
Okay, so we're talking about drugs like LSD here, and we're saying that you might have some visionary experience after you've taken LSD, and that may, even after the effect's worn off, the memory of that effect or something can have an impact on how you see the world and how you think about certain things, and that may, say if you're a writer like me, that may affect some aspects of the texture of your writing. So it might be positive. But a drug like that can also have negative impacts on some other people. I think that all that is actually true about LSD, but I don't have a lot of proof of that. I've had some kind of anecdotal experience, you might say, with those sorts of drugs, and I think that's probably all true. I'm not sure what you have in mind when you ask me about enhancers. I mean, you might say LSD is an enhancer because it is using technology in a quite direct way to alter people, the functioning of someone's brain, right? So I suppose the nearest thing would be if you could alter somebody's genetics in a way that altered their potential for those sorts of experiences. I mean, doubtless there are people who've had visionary experiences a bit like that without taking LSD. So I mean, if we're having a narrow analogy, I suppose you could alter someone's genetic potential to have those kinds of experiences. And I guess in altering someone's genetic potential in any way, you could have the effect that, depending upon what other genetic makeup they have in their genome or what environmental experiences they have, there could be a downside. We know that genes work in that way. There's not some one to one correspondence between a particular variant, a particular point on the human genome, and the way someone will actually turn out. Rather, the way that genetic change will take place will depend upon the environment that comes about, and the contribution that that gene or that sequence, that genetic sequence within the genome has. That could vary. It could have multiple effects, and those effects can be mediated by the rest of the genome of that individual. So yes, at a wider level, it's always possible that some particular genetic tampering could have both benefits and drawbacks for the individual, and that those could be unpredictable. They can be unpredictable because the environment in which that individual operate is unpredictable, and they can also be unpredictable because we don't know enough about how that change will interact with other aspects of that person's individual genome. So all of that is true at that sort of abstract level, absolutely. That said, though, it may well be that some changes that we could make to the human genome will be sufficiently robust across a whole range of environments that we can say in a way that's not too misleading that we are here modifying for greater genetic potential. We are modifying for greater problem-solving intelligence or creativity of a certain kind, or strength, or suppleness, some other physical characteristic, greater acuity of some sense perception. And we may be able in some cases to say not only is it pretty robust, but we can't really see much likelihood of a downside. So look, it's going to vary greatly, and that's because genetic science is so damn complicated. Right? So that's all I can say. It is damn complicated. In any particular case, we can't be sure, but there may be some particular cases that we develop over time where we can pretty much eliminate the downside in the real world given the accessible range of environments that we have and what else we know about the human genome. I don't know, maybe that's going well beyond your question. It does become a quite abstract thing, but I guess what it reminds me of is just the great complexity of genetic science and how much it's gene-gene interaction and gene-environment interaction, not just, we change this bit of the sequence, the DNA sequence, and lo and behold, at the other end, we have a quite predictable sort of positive outcome. But, it's not like that, and trying to get it like that will be very hard.
Yeah, it's not like we're using a scalpel to sort of cut a certain particular trait out or modify something by, tweaking a few levers or pressing buttons.
Yeah. I mean, there's often an air of unreality around these discussions because we make all sorts of assumptions about what can be done. But in the real world, there are all these damn complexities. It's just so massively interactive at both the gene level and the gene environment level that to some extent we're always, to use my favourite expression today, talking through our hats when we talk about some of these things. With this massive interaction, we just don't know what can be achieved in some kind of robust, predictable way. It's a strange thing. I'm not sure what human nature is. I'm not sure what humanity is. I mean, I do know that genetic scientists can look at, a printout or an analysis of a genome and another one, and tell that one of them's human and the other's chimpanzee. That there is a sense that you can distinguish, an obvious sense in which you distinguish the human genome from some other genome, right? And we go into the intricacies of that if you wanted to, but scientists can certainly distinguish at that level what humanity is. I suppose you could modify the genome of an individual embryo so dramatically that it no longer looked like human DNA. I suppose in principle that could be done. But that's kind of at a ridiculous level. No one's seriously talking about doing anything like that. So the question is, when we make some other kind of modification, which might be an environmental one, through something like, say, training or education, or giving someone certain equipment, or when we make within the human genome some kind of engineered change at the level of the variance of a particular strand of DNA, are we taking away some positive thing, some factor X about humankind, right? Yeah, it's sort of thing that Francis Fukuyama sometimes talks about. And I don't think there's any reason to think anything like that at all. What I do think is, sure, you could make some changes to people, either by environmental innovation or by genetic innovation, which would make them worse people in a sense, right? So if you could work out what kind of genetic sequencing change would be needed for that embryo to have the potential to develop into, as a child and an adult, develop into a psychopath, and you made that change, well, I think we'd all make the joke, that's a bad thing you've just done, right? It's not because the person's no longer human, it's because they've been altered in such a way that they're probably going to be, a sort of manipulative human being without empathy for others, etc., and they're going to cause trouble all around them. They'll do destructive things. If there's enough of them, society will be drastically affected, etc. So it's a bad thing to do to that embryo, but it's not a bad thing to do because it's no longer human. There are all too many human beings who are already like that. It's a bad thing to do because you're probably laying up trouble for the future for everyone who's going to be affected by the human being that embryo will become, including that human being itself, no doubt. Probably spend time in jail and so on. It's a bad thing because of the consequences it produces. But this idea that somehow it's no longer human, well, that just doesn't come into it.
With regard to conception through somatic nuclear transfer technique,
Right. Yeah.
pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or genetic engineering, arguments about safety or even about the welfare of growing children do not explain the character of the actual debate or real-world policy responses to liberal societies. What are your thoughts? How would you describe the debate and the policy responses?
Yeah. Look, I think what you've just said is totally true. You look at these policy responses, which have been to introduce, in many cases, quite draconian laws and incredibly restrictive regulation of research and so on. I don't think all that can be explained by questions about the welfare of children. I mean, some of it seems to be just that it's a violation of nature or something. If we go down this path, and so we must allow it only in some very limited way for some very specific benefit, or we should not allow it at all. With reproductive cloning in particular, it's not as if we've just introduced regulation to ensure that doctors probably don't use this technique while the technique's not safe, right? We don't want any research on it at all. The place we've put the regulation, which tends to be in the criminal law, or at least in some countries and some jurisdictions, seems like the wrong place for that. We're treating it as if creating a child through the somatic cell nuclear transfer technique is something analogous to murder or rape. It's something that goes in the core criminal law with the same kind of criminal penalties attached to it. That doesn't seem like what we would normally do for regulating medicine or for regulating medical research. It seems more like there's a kind of moral repugnance thing going on here. It's as if we think it is like rape or murder. We seem like crazy analogies, but that's the kind of thinking that seems to be going on in at least some jurisdictions as the public policy has been developed. Now, I think it's fairly clear that you would want regulation in place so that you don't have crazy, maverick doctors who just go off and produce children by somatic cell nuclear transfer, without any guarantee that it will be safe. Given that we know the problems that have arisen for various other mammal species. So you would have some sort of regulation of that, perhaps through medical boards or the other standard ways that you regulate medical research. But the kinds of laws that have been discussed don't have that narrow focus, and they don't handle it in that way, as if it's just regulation of of research and medicine. They treat it as if it's much more analogous to those core crimes.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, that's hangovers from sort of religious influence.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah, religious influence or other kind of quasi mystical influences. But also, I mean, Hollywood has a lot to answer for. Fears that we're going to create hybrids of human beings and rabbits bouncing down the street or something. Or there'll be evil clones wandering around taking over the world or something. And I mean, if you pin down individuals saying, well, what really do you fear? I guess I don't know enough about what they'd say because I haven't had the conversation with enough individuals that do have fears. But it does seem that people have all sorts of irrational fears. And once again, they may not know themselves what it really is because their motivations and so on are often not transparent to us. But when we're constantly bombarded, with images from Hollywood and from the rest of the entertainment industry about the sort of evils associated with these sorts of technologies, you can end up with quite vague, inchoate fears somewhere at the back of the mind that perhaps you can't define yourself that make you go, oh my God, human cloning. So it could be even at that level. So it's not necessarily religion. It's a whole lot of other stuff factoring in here, as well.
Yeah, I guess a lot of Hollywood's plot devices have been based on pre-existing fears, and they'll leverage those in a sense because fear is a very strong motivator.
Yeah. I mean, look, narratives, whether it's cinema or novels or whatever, narratives confront us with our fears very often. I mean, that's often what makes narratives interesting, that they confront us with our fears and they show, or some version of them, perhaps some distorted version of them, and they often show characters who kind of overcome those things that we fear, right? That's often what drives narrative. And so it's fairly natural to use that word, but it's predictable that you'll get narratives about these sorts of technologies in which they become fearful things, or they're associated with fearful things, and there are things to be overcome.
Now, you've written quite a few science fiction novels and short stories as well.
Yeah, there's a body of professional work there in that field.
So,
sure.
Have you explored any of these topics in some of your writing?
Oh, to some extent. To some extent, some of those writings are pushback against what I've just been talking about. I actually wrote 3 novels about 10 years ago now, 8 or 10 years ago, for the Terminator franchise. Long story as to how I came to do this. It was a fun thing to do, and it's something I'm very glad that I did. Now, as I guess everybody now knows, the story of the Terminator involves a scenario where this supercomputer called Skynet basically brings about the near destruction of humanity. It brings about a nuclear war. It fights back when they want to shut it down in the original version of the story. And it brings about a nuclear war, killing the vast majority of human beings, and it tries to hunt down the rest. And it goes on from there. So we have this nightmare, desolate, post-apocalyptic future, which impinges on the present because time travel's involved. So everyone knows that about the Terminator, and there's a very strong technophobic element here, of course, about artificial intelligence and so on. But I think what's really driving it is a fear of automated weapons of mass destruction. I mean, going back to the early 1980s when the first Terminator movie was being developed, that was a time of great fear of nuclear war, perhaps the greatest time of fear of nuclear war since the Cuban crisis in the 1960s. And so there was this quite understandable fear of massive destruction through war using nuclear-powered systems, nuclear warheads, and increasingly automated systems. That's not irrational at all, right? But it nonetheless feeds into a broader technophobia that operates. So there's that tension going on between something that's quite rational and this more general suspicion of technology. I got to do 3 books associated with the Terminator franchise. They actually follow on from the second Terminator movie, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. In my books, what has actually happened is that Sarah Connor and John Connor, the main human characters, have managed to avert Judgment Day, avert this nuclear war that was to take place in the late 1990s. But what happens is some further years down the track, a couple of decades down the track, Judgment Day does actually happen in a rather different way. Now, in that future, with a couple of decades of developments in genetic science and so on, Judgment Day happens in a world where there actually are genetically enhanced people. Right? There's some of these people kind of rattling around. They're very young. I think probably in most cases that's true. There's some earlier ones as well, now I think about it. But the point is, in this world, some of the people who've survived have been from a kind of enclave, isolated from society, where these genetically modified people exist. And they do have cognitive and physical abilities far beyond those that you and I have. And those people are actually much better equipped to fight back against a Terminator than you or I would be, or than anyone would be. And they can become quite interesting characters. Now, again, there's a time travel element involved, and you end up with some of those people actually coming back to the present day. And there's stuff in good Terminator traditional style. There's stuff going on where John Connor and Sarah Connor, his mother, are involved with those people, those warriors from the future, and with a Terminator from the future, a Terminator that can kind of semi-replicate itself and can inject itself into human beings and control them mentally, and the story goes on from there. Now, that's a very long-winded way of working in to say that I present those genetically engineered warriors in the future in a very sympathetic manner. And some of them get killed, of course. They don't have it all their own way. These Terminators are pretty bad dudes that have to deal with. But I do present these genetically modified people in a very sympathetic manner. So that was a kind of fun thing, getting even within the Terminator franchise, but in a way I think was very true to the Terminator franchise, to have a bit of technophilic, if you like, pushback. I think that is kind of a legitimate thing to do, because even within the Terminator movies, the technology actually has a kind of allure about it, as well as being about it. It's not entirely technophobic. And of course, notoriously, in the second movie, the Arnold Schwarzenegger character is a kind of nice Terminator. So I think it's legitimate to have this kind of element about technology that's not entirely technophobic, but to the extent that I was able to bring genetic enhancement technology as a new element of the Terminator franchise, I do it in a way that's quite positive. And in fact, there's a character that I kind of fell in love with. She's the love interest for John Connor, who's a teenager by this time. So this character, Jade, who's quite young, but genetically modified. I guess she's still a girl, she's still a teenager, but I mean, very, very smart, highly advanced intellect, highly advanced physical abilities as well. She's a really great character, and at times, she's acting like the heroine of the story in a bit the same way that the good Terminators can act, right? So we've got this human character, not a cyborg character, this genetically modified character, who is able to play at times very decisive roles in the wars that they're fighting through a trilogy of novels, against the Terminators. So that was a lot of fun.
Does the harm principle applied to enhancement technologies in some sense parallel the drug debates, or the right to own a gun? Does the government have a super nanny society as it seems that the average person is not informed or well balanced enough to make his or her own decisions when it comes to possible destruction of self or others.
Whoa! Look, the harm principle should apply. I mean, you really should only criminalise things if there are secular harms involved. Right? Now, there is an interesting question about at what point do you criminalise things. It's one thing to criminalise using a gun to shoot people. It's another thing to criminalise owning a gun. So, this is a question. Is widespread gun ownership so likely to lead to greater numbers of murders and so on that we should come in and regulate at that earlier level? And look, I think there's a strong case to do so. I'm not some gun nut that says we should let everyone own guns. But I'm just saying that the harm principle is interesting in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is at what point in the process do you apply it? Do you only apply at the level of shooting people, or do you apply at the level of regulating who can even have a gun? Nonetheless, all that said, the harm principle presumably is operating when we regulate guns. They are dangerous things. They cause people harms, right? And they cause harms to other people who are unwilling, and they're harms that are substantial. So the harm principle at least applies to gun law, though you can then have an interesting debate about exactly what form gun law should take. Drugs are a bit different because by and large, you're harming yourself. If I take LSD, to use an example from earlier in the interview, and it has some negative impact on my brain, and I'm harming myself, right? There may be some consequential harms to other people, but they're likely to be relatively remote and indirect. We tend not to want to regulate harms that are too remote and indirect. So there are reasons why you might be slow to regulate the use of something like LSD if some people find it beneficial and if it's not having direct harms on other people. Now, with something like genetic technologies, again, you're going to ask, well, what are the harms? And not the harms to yourself. If I take some technology that, I take a drug or something, that's been matched to my genome so that some aspect of my genetic makeup is expressed in a way that would not otherwise happen if I didn't take the drug, right? There's a use of genetic technology that's going to modify something about me, but it might benefit me. But it might also, I suppose, harm me, but it's not directly going to harm anyone else. The only person directly harmed is me. So I think pretty similar principles apply. We should be looking at the benefits, but the harms. And we're particularly concerned in the law about harms to other people, the people who didn't make the decision. And we're particularly concerned about harms that are fairly direct, so they can't be dealt with in less intrusive ways. And harms that are sufficiently substantial that public resources should be used on them. Those kinds of principles that we could doubtless go on, should apply to the whole range of these things that we're contemplating criminalising. That's how I see it.